Hi, welcome to our focus on language arts. So in this first lecture in this unit, what we're going to do is to take a look at how language can be especially challenging in its own way for students, English language learners in language arts. And I'm kind of hoping that what I share with you, two things happen, that it makes sense with your own experience that you've had with language arts, but also that it surprises you a little bit. It may not be the challenges that you're expecting me to share. So there is a handout, should look like this, that's waiting for you in our Canvas modules. And I highly suggest that you either have it on another screen or you have it printed out while you're following along in this lecture. I'll be referring to it. So the first thing that I want to talk about with language arts are the multiple genres that exist. Now when we started in the very same place with social studies, right? But the problem there was that there's a mishmash of lots of different genres, and they're one right after the other in a social studies chapter. This isn't exactly the same issue, but rather what it is there are so many different genres that are covered in language arts, and many of them, to an English language learner, are going to look the same. Now, in social studies, the issue around the different genres, part of the issue was around grammar. So if you have a paragraph that's about the biology of an area, it'll be written in present tense, and then if you switch to a paragraph that's history, then it's going to past tense, that kind of thing. This is a different kind of issue. So take a look at the list that I have underneath multiple genres. Take a look at that list. I start with folk tales, and then I go to fairy tales, fables, tall tales, legend, and myth. So just for a moment, stop and think about what all of those have in common. If I were to hand you, without a label, if I were to hand you a one-page story that was one of these, chances are that they would look almost exactly the same to you. But there are different there are different expectations that the reader can make from each of these. There's a different relationship between reader and author, and there's different kind of playful kind of pieces that show up in some of these. And so with the multiple genres that students encounter in language arts, the problem is not switching from this type of grammar to that type of grammar, but rather for a student being able to be clear in their mind what to expect in the story, what kinds of things to expect, what kinds of things to look for, how they're supposed to make sense of the story. So let's take a look at some of the differences and what the kind of expectations that a student would have that would be a little bit different. So for example, a folk tale is a story. Now it's got the word folk in it, so it's coming from people. It was originally a spoken tale. And a fairy tale would look very similar on paper. They would both start with once upon a time, probably, and they would both be written in past tense. They would both probably be referring to, obviously, a time that's not now. But a fairy tale was usually written down by an author, and we can expect certain things from it that just like it says fairy tale, it starts with fairy, we can expect that some things that don't normally happen might happen. Maybe animals will talk. Maybe there will be some kind of creature in the story that normally we don't see walking around, we don't interact with. And so it seems like a small kind of difference there, but if you are an English language learner and you encounter a story and it starts out with once upon a time. Part of the way that you need to make sense of it is to be able to predict who's going to be talking, who's going to be acting, who are the characters in this story, what kinds of things are possible. With a folk tale, it's the things that are possible are the things that we normally think are possible. People walk and talk, stories are told, problems get worked out, that kind of thing. A fairy tale, there might be witches, there might be fairies, there might be creatures that we've never seen before, and so there's a very different set of expectations and predictions that a student would bring to a fairy tale than they would bring to a folk tale. And take a look at fable. What does that mean? A fable is essentially a folk tale that has a moral. Often when you see a fable written down, it'll look like a one-page story, and then all by itself there'll be a sentence. And what is that? What is that sentence? That's kind of the moral of the story. And in other words, a fable is a folk tale that we tell that has a meaning. It's got a teaching point. It's the kind of thing that caregivers might tell children to kind of shape their character. And so again, a folk tale, a fairy tale, a fable to an English language learner, they're all going to look the same. They're all going to start with once upon a time. But in a fable, definitely, usually animals are talking. And again, for an English language learner, having that expectation that animals can talk is probably a key way of interpreting what these actions are and what's actually happening in the story. What's a tall tale? A tall tale is essentially a folk tale that, when it says tall, imagine it's stretched. So a tall tale usually is kind of grounded in a real person who really existed, and they did something pretty great, but the tall tale pulls it out even more. And maybe they were really strong. Well, in the tall tale, suddenly they're lifting trains and they're picking up houses with their hands, that kind of thing. And so again, a tall tale and a folk tale on paper are going to look the same to an English language learner. Once upon a time, written in the past tense. They're both about people. There's not animals talking, it's people. And yet, we know that when we encounter a tall tale, we can expect that people are going to be able to do kind of supernatural things, whereas in a folk tale, that usually doesn't happen. So take a look at the last two I have there, legend and myth. Legend and myth. A legend is a folk tale that is grounded in some kind of truth, and it takes on a meaning for a community, whether that community is an area of the world or it's some other kind of community, but it kind of takes on meaning around the person that folk tale or that tall tale is about. And a myth is the religious version of that. So when a folk tale takes on religious meaning or meaning within a religious community, that is what a myth is. So again, they're all going to look the same when you put them in front of a student. They all have past tense. They all begin with once upon a time often. And yet, the expectations and the interpretation of the meaning, think about the difference between interpreting a myth and a tall tale. A myth, there's some reverence there, right? As with a legend, there's some reverence. You're looking for what is it that this community values, and how does this story connect with what this community values today. Whereas just a tall tale, it's taken with quite a grain of salt, and yet there's an understanding that this person really did exist. Completely different than a fairy tale, well, where probably we're not supposed to interpret any of the characters as having historically lived. So what I'm hoping you're beginning to see is that the first challenge that students encounter in language arts is that a lot of the stories that are put in front of them look like every other story that's put in front of them, and yet they are a different genre. And those different genres have different expectations of what you can expect from the story, what the meaning of the story is, whether or not we're simply supposed to laugh at the story or be entertained, or if we're supposed to take some religious meaning or some political meaning, that kind of thing. And so to an English language learner, all of that would be invisible unless you make it visible to them. You make that part of the pre-teaching, and you help them kind of set up their expectations around that. Okay, so we started our lecture about language arts, about the language of language arts, exactly where we started with social studies, but now you can see it's a very different issue that students are dealing with around genres. Now the next thing I want to talk about, and I'm moving on to the next part of the handout, is around vocabulary. So we know that students, English language learners, are always learning vocabulary. That's what they do. But when you enter language arts, in that discipline, the learning takes on different dimensions of meaning. So, for example, when I'm working with my fifth graders that I work with on Tuesdays and Thursdays, who are beginning English language learners, we are always working on vocabulary. And I have them keeping personal vocabulary notebooks. When we encounter a new word and we have the time, they enter the word alphabetically into their notebook, and they enter either a meaning, either in English or in Korean, or a picture that will help them remember what it means. When we jump to language arts, vocabulary learning takes on a completely different dimension, many different dimensions. For example, the first example I have there for you is homonyms. Go back to your 7th or 8th grade English class. What's a homonym? Two words that sound the same, but they have different meanings. And so a homonym, suddenly we need to be differentiating on paper different than just what we hear. And so students have to pull apart the way a word is written and the way it sounds, and now they have to be thinking in this kind of other dimension. We also focus a lot on synonyms, and so groups of words that tend to have the same meaning. And it's a great way for English language learners to learn, but it's challenging too. What research says is even though we tend to learn in kind of collocations, groups of words that go together, we are more likely to remember a word the first or second or third time we hear it or see it if it's completely kind of an outlier to everything else we're learning right now. So when it kind of stands out, when it stands out by itself. And so when we're learning words in groups of synonyms, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, it makes complete sense. It's the way we learn in school. But it does make it a little more challenging for students to kind of remember these groups of words that tend to mean basically the same thing. And that leads directly into the next challenge, because when we're learning synonyms, we're not being taught all these words are exactly the same. We're beginning to get a sense of the feeling that a word shares with the reader or the listener. And that's the connotative meaning. So there's denotative, like what it means, and then there's connotative, what it connotes. So what kind of feeling or attitude or image it brings up for the listener or the reader. And this is tough stuff. So me working with my beginning language learners, just getting that denoted meaning, that is a huge battle. Now, in language arts, we're starting to get a sense of how words feel. And So if someone answers with a particular word, being able to tell, do they approve or do they disapprove? Do they have a positive attitude towards this or a negative attitude? That kind of thing. That is tough stuff, really tough stuff for English language learners. And then it gets even more difficult, because sometimes a lake is not just a lake, or an apple is not just an apple, or a gift is not just a gift. Sometimes it takes on, as you look at the handout, sometimes it takes on a metaphorical meaning, or it becomes a symbol. So sometimes, so think back to me working with my beginning English language learners, it's hard enough just to make sure that they know what apple denotes. Now, when we read a story where an apple takes on meaning, or a flower, for example, I just read The Golden Touch with my students, and that's the story about the king who has lots of gold. He hankers after more gold, and someone makes a deal with him. He gives him the golden touch, so everything he touches becomes gold. His daughter has a beautiful flower garden that she cares about very much, and he wants to make it even better for her, so he touches the flowers. And in his mind, it's a beautiful step. It's a step forward. For her, it's the greatest sadness of her life, because her living flowers are no longer living. And so the flower, we were working on just the denotive meaning of what is a flower and learning how to spell it and how to say it. Now, in that story, flower takes on a symbolic meaning, and that is the different worldviews of the mother and, of the daughter and the father. So with metaphorical meaning, symbols, you can see that now we're adding on these extra dimensions. And once my students learn the denotative meaning of apple, they can use that wherever they go. But the metaphorical meaning of apple, or the symbol of the apple, is going to change from story to story, right? Just like a flower in The Golden Touch had a symbolic meaning, and that using the symbol of a flower might change from story to story. And so I think you can see that, wow, now we're adding these additional dimensions. And then we have the concept of imagery. And imagery is when the writer or the speaker puts great thought into trying to create an image of something for the listener or for the reader. And so again, sometimes a lot of focus is on nouns, things that students might know the denotative meaning of, but they have to kind of step back a little bit and think about what kind of image is being created. So this is another dimension of meaning that you find in literature that's not just a matter of drawing a picture of apple next to the word apple, for example. And so I really want you to kind of walk away with this understanding that obviously English language learners are learning vocabulary wherever they go, whatever discipline they're in. But when they step into language arts, it's a completely different game. A word is no longer just a word. So, moving on, another reason that language arts is so very challenging around language for English language learners is that the topics are so abstract. When I'm working with my beginning English language learners, I'm hauling in bags of realia, lots and lots of pictures. I'm acting things out, I'm gesturing, I'm doing all of that so that learning becomes concrete. So for example, when I was reading with one of my students yesterday and they came across the word kitchen, and that word had never come up before, and the student didn't know what kitchen meant. Where I meet with the student is near the school kitchen. So we actually walked down the hallway and we took a look, and the cook was in there, and the cook talked to us about the kitchen. So that is the opposite. That is concrete learning connected with real things, real experiences. It's the exact opposite that students usually encounter in language arts, because usually what they encounter are very abstract topics. And I've got a list there. Let's go through them together. So one of the ways that the topics are so abstract in language arts is because we're asking students to engage with texts in really abstract ways. We're talking to them about who are the characters in the story, what's the plot, in other words, what happened. And I encounter this with English language learners often. Even plot, you think to yourself, well, that's concrete actions that happened. But you're asking students to differentiate between the significant things that happened and the less significant things that happened. So when we ask a student to retell a plot, we may think this is a really concrete thing, but really we're asking them to carry out an abstract intellectual process of differentiating the important details and the less important details. So even plot turns out to be very abstract. There's also setting. Where does it take place? And even then, so a beginning student might be able to say the barn or a small town, that kind of thing. But even then, we're asking for a little bit more than that, aren't we? We're asking for kind of a sense of time and what the place feels like, and that's more abstract as well. We're often asking students to talk to us about what's the conflict, what's the problem, and then what's the climax, what's that moment where it all comes together and either it's going to fall apart or it's going to work out, and then what's the resolution. And these are really abstract. Again, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what the problem is, that's very concrete. But that means that the English language learner has to take those concrete sentences that they've written and draw out some kind of meaning and be able to tell you what the problem is. And for an English language learner, sometimes the most they can do, like with the golden touch, is to say gold, right? That's all they can get out. And so being able to draw them out and getting them to understand what it is that you're asking them to tell you it's pretty tough stuff. So very abstract. Another aspect of how we really focus on abstract topics in language arts is we're asking students to engage with language in the very ways that you would think would help them the most, right? We're talking about subjects and verbs. We're having them circle or add punctuation. We're having them differentiate between clauses and phrases. I know some of you are still struggling with that yourselves. Tenses, voice, passive voice versus active voice. But for K through 12 students, especially for those who didn't get to experience schooling in their first language, so they're Generation 1.5 students. For those students, talking about language in this way is really, really challenging. They are attempting to acquire it. The younger they are, the more they're attempting to acquire it. And this is asking them not only to learn it like a discipline, but also to have the 10,000 foot view and be able to talk about what it is that they are in the middle of learning. And so certainly I think all of this kind of learning, talking about subjects and verbs and punctuation, all of that, it's important for everyone. Maybe it's even more important for English language learners, but it's tough stuff, especially the younger the language learner is, in my experience. We are also in language arts. This is the place where we talk to students about writing. And it's here that they're hearing words like thesis statement, theme, topic sentence. And I can tell you from having taught many English language learners, this is huge. That is tough stuff. To be able to distinguish between theme and topic, and theme and thesis statement and topic sentence, it is huge. And the only way to express it to students, besides showing them lots of examples, is really with very abstract terms. Because when you think about it, the fact that a thesis statement is the whole idea of the entire essay, and that a topic sentence is the whole idea of just one paragraph, the way that you're going to have to express that is pretty abstract. That's a big idea. And even for those language learners who began their schooling in another language, or they're lucky enough to have learned to read and or maybe even write in that first language, in a lot of languages, you don't have topic sentences, you don't have thesis statements. So not only are we asking them to engage with language in ways that are going to be challenging and abstract, they might actually fly in the face culturally. And I know I'm getting into culture, I shouldn't do that, that's for our next lecture, but it can fly in the face of what they know culturally. And the last thing I have, the last example under abstract topics, I have language for language's sake. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that I know that I, as a teacher, when I put an essay in front of students, it is often because I think it's beautiful. I think it is just an amazing use of English. And just my attitude about that, just my instinct to put that in front of students means that it's going to be a really high level of English, right? It's going to be a writer or a speaker who not only can write or speak in English, they can dance with it. They can play with it. They have kind of reached a pinnacle of what we can do when we're writing or speaking with English. So sometimes we're putting language in front of students just because it's a beautiful specimen of language. And that is, again, think about it, that's far more than just the denotative understanding of what the sentence means. That's far more than understanding that an apple is an apple. And so I just kind of want you to kind of reflect on that a little bit and be aware of that in your own teaching as well, is that putting something in front of the students because it's beautiful, I'm not saying don't do it, just be aware that the more beautiful it is, it's very possible that the more challenging it is for the English language learners too. And the way that you're asking students to engage with the beauty of that is going to be more challenging for English language learners. Another thing I wanted to talk about that makes language arts really challenging for English language learners is the fact that we are often putting really dense encoded text in front of them. And I have 3 examples there. Take a look at those. I've got poetry, story endings, and imagery. And poetry, by definition, is really, really brief. It's reduced, almost like sometimes I cook sauces. I reduce sauces, so I put a lot of things in a pot. I let it cook over a long time, and what I'm left with is just a really tiny amount of sauce that's very flavorful. And that's what poetry is, really. Taking a short story, taking a novel, taking an experience, and boiling it down, reducing it down, so that there's very little language left, but it's just beautiful and flavorful. And just the fact that there's less words to deal with, you might think, well, easier for the English language learners, but every word in a poem is pretty weighty. And to kind of understand that weight, interpret it, that's hard work for English language learners. Another thing I wanted you to think about is often the way stories, and sometimes essays as well, the way they end is kind of encoded. There's kind of a hidden understanding, so that when you read an essay, for example, you might realize that it ends on a really sad note. But the way that you understand that, you're reading between the lines. You're looking at the connotations of the words that are used. In other words, you are digging down deep into the meaning of the English that's there in that story ending or that essay ending. And your English language learners probably aren't going to be able to do that without support. So that's another kind of dense type of English that they encounter. And finally, imagery. Often we create images with essays or short stories or with novels or with speeches. We create imagery, we use imagery, we create images. And again, these may be really, really dense, and you and I may realize that the author is creating a really sweet and gentle place for us, or is creating a really chaotic and scary place for us. But what an English language learner may simply see is house, tree, street, that kind of thing. So they're just seeing those kind of concrete nouns that they can interpret, rather than seeing the deeper level, which is what kind of feeling are we getting from this image? What kind of picture are we getting from this image? So lots of dense and encoded text. And finally, another way, this is kind of like genres, another way that we challenge English language learners is often from story to essay to novel to speech. What we're putting in front of students is representative of a wide variety of English forms, as it should be. I'm all for different dialects. I grew up speaking a very different dialect, a rural Indiana farm dialect that probably has its roots in German. That's my heritage language. And so I think we should be putting different dialects in front of students, letting them experience different writers' ways of capturing the way people really spoke in a certain place or at a certain time or in a certain community. And but this is where grammar, spelling, reductions, meaning saying, instead of saying going to, saying gonna, for example, that's a reduction. You and I may just trip right over it and be able to interpret it and maybe even say it aloud say it to ourselves. But for an English language learner, they may come to what's meant to capture oral speech and realize, they don't know what that word is. They don't recognize that it's a reduction of another sound. So I've got some examples there. You may be thinking, what is she talking about? But I've got some examples here just to give you a sense. So taken from Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which is read by a lot of different school districts. Here's the beginning. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but that ain't no matter. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth mainly. There was things which he stretched, but mainly he told the truth. So one thing you've got there, you've got double negatives. Ain't, no. And if an English language learner, they might have heard the word ain't, but it's very likely by the time they read this, they've never seen it in writing, because we don't tend to write that way. That's an informal way to speak or to write, and we don't tend to write in school with ain't. And we usually don't use double negatives in standard English. And so now the English that I grew up with, we can use double negatives, but I didn't encounter that in school. I just encountered that at home. Here's another example. And this comes from William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, a different part of the South he was writing about. The somebody you was young with, and you growed old in her, and she growed old in you, seeing the old coming on, and it was the one somebody you could hear say it don't matter, and know it was the truth out in the hard world, and all a man's grief and trials. And to tell you the truth, I have no idea what that means. It was kind of an extreme example that I've got for you. But there's an example of, obviously William Faulkner was trying to capture how someone spoke at that time. And even I'm not quite sure how to decode that. And then we have Zora Neale Hurston from Their Eyes Were Watching God. And I chose this because it's a wonderful example of the way that the speech is written down is the way that someone might say it. So this is going to be African American English. If God don't think no more about them than I do, they's a lost ball into high grass. So that was Zora Neale Hurston attempting to capture some oral language in a quote in her novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And so, for example, when you see the EM, we know that that's an abbreviated, that's a reduction of them. But if you're an English language learner, this sentence may actually look completely incomprehensible with the replaced with de, right? Not recognizing that that's the way it sounds when certain dialects use English. And so, anyways, just some great examples. Hopefully, you've got just a little taste there of how dialects can really impact the challenge that English language learners encounter when they're in language arts. So we've talked about the multiple genres, and I looked at just a few there are so many different genres, as you probably know, that are covered in language arts, and what I gave you is just a few, and I think now you can see how intertwined they are, and yet how different they are. How to an English language learner they might look the same, but actually the expectations are quite different. Learning words in language arts is not just learning words in language arts. The topics we put in front of students are so abstract, and the text that we put in front of students is often so dense and so encoded it's hard to wade through, and then they encounter the writing or the speaking of different dialects, which can be another challenge of language. So what I'm hoping is that as I walk through this, at least part of it, you thought, yeah, that makes sense. But I'm kind of hoping, too, that I surprised you a little bit with some of this information. That would give me a sense that this is fresh information for you. Okay, there are some chapters waiting for you to read, and possibly some other links I've forgotten. And then I'll meet you in the discussion where we talk about language arts, and specifically around one sample of language arts text and how it could be especially challenging in language for our ELLs. Okay, I'll see you online.